The Classical Anarchists, Part 3. Peter Kropotkin. If Bakunin was the man of fire and brimstone, Peter Kropotkin was the man of tea and crumpets. If Bakunin was the man of action, Kropotkin was the man of reflection. Despite their temperamental and intellectual differences, however, Bakunin and Kropotkin were, at bottom, not totally dissimilar. Real as their intellectual and temperamental differences were, they were perhaps exaggerated by circumstances. As a creature of the early 19th century, Bakunin was, at heart, a romantic revolutionary, translating the Hegelian dialectic into a doctrine of salvation through destruction. Kropotkin, on the other hand, born into the mid-19th century, was a non-apocalyptic evolutionary. Bakunin has the street fighter's appreciation for the concrete and the practical. Kropotkin inspired more visionary and optimistic, if less practical, schemes. Like Bakunin, Kropotkin too was a member of the Russian nobility. As a member of the Corps of Pages, he was one of a very select few whose prospects for personal advancement were gold-plated. As a sergeant in the Corps, he was for a year the personal page of the new Tsar Alexander II. A number of things drew him away from a military career, among them his nascent liberal tendencies, which were not lessened by the idiocies of military life, but perhaps, most significantly, a growing passion for the sciences. Kropotkin's liberal and scientific ambitions prompted him to apply for a commission in a regiment stationed in Russia's wild east, Siberia. Unlike Bakunin, Kropotkin arrived in Siberia by his own choice and as a free man. One of his responsibilities was to inspect the penal system in operation in Siberia. His experience of the brutalities of this system was to shake his faith in the wisdom of the state and put him on the road that would eventually take him to anarchism. Kropotkin's scientific energies found expression in his geographic work, an exploration of the Siberian highlands, and the subsequent account of the glacial age and the desiccation of East Asia. While in Siberia, Kropotkin made the acquaintance of the poet Emil Mikhailov, who introduced him to the writings of Proudhon. Having read Proudhon's economic contradictions, Kropotkin came to regard himself as a socialist. In 1866, Kropotkin resigned his commission and returned to St. Petersburg to begin the life of an academic. After some years, his expertise as a geographer attracted the attention of the Russian Geographical Society, who offered him a secretaryship. At this point, Kropotkin's liberal and scientific impulses came into conflict. He declined the offer, feeling that he had no right to indulge his academic interests while so many people were without the basic necessaries of life. As many Russians before and after him have done, Kropotkin decided to travel to the West. He settled for a time in Zurich and became part of the large Russian colony there, reading widely and deeply in socialist and revolutionary literature. From Zurich, he went to Geneva, where he made the acquaintance of Zhukovsky. Exciting as all this theoretical exploration was to him, Kropotkin felt the need for some practical experience of the working class, so on Zhukovsky's recommendation, he went to live among the people of the Jura. Here, he found the practical exemplification of all the theoretical material he had been reading about, which brought about in him what can only be described as a conversion experience. He wrote, "The theoretical aspects of anarchism, as they were then beginning to be expressed in the Jura Federation, especially Bakunin, the criticism of state socialism, the fear of an economic despotism, far more dangerous than the merely political despotism, which I here formulated there, and the revolutionary character of the agitation appealed strongly to my mind. But the equalitarian relations which I found in the Jura Mountains, the independence of thought and expression which I saw developing in the workers, and their unlimited devotion to the cause appealed even more strongly to my feelings. And when I came away from the mountains, after a week's stay with the watchmakers, my views upon socialism were settled. I was an anarchist." Kropotkin returned to St. Petersburg as an apostle of anarchism, there to join the not particularly anarchist Tchaikovsky circle, but more importantly, to begin what would be a long and prolific literary career. His thought at this time seems to have been a mixture of Proudhon and Bakunin, with a slight tendency in favour of Bakunin. As a member of the Tchaikovsky Circle, he engaged in propaganda work, for which he was arrested and imprisoned in the Peter and Paul fortress in 1874. 2 years later, he escaped from the St. Petersburg military hospital, travelling first to England and then back to Switzerland. In Kropotkin's incomparable account in his memoirs, writes Schatz, the meticulously organised plot had all the ingredients of a spy thriller: safe houses, a coded message hidden in a watch, a heart-stopping getaway through the streets of the capital. Around this time, his understanding of what anarchism was began to develop. He wrote, "I gradually came to realize that anarchism represents more than a mere mode of action and a mere conception of a free society, that it is a part of a philosophy, natural and social, which must be developed in a quite different way from the metaphysical or dialectical methods which have been employed in sciences dealing with man. I saw that it must be treated by the same methods as natural science." Though never a card-carrying agitator in the manner of Bakunin, Kropotkin was at this time still attracted to practical organisation, so that his writings were only a part of his overall enterprise. Among the most significant of his publications was the production of the anarchist newspaper La Révolte, for which at the start he did most of the writing. Kropotkin's early articles in La Révolte were concerned mostly with current issues, treated with an optimism that saw in every strike or bread riot a hopeful omen of the disintegration of the great national states, which he saw as the particular enemies of peace and social justice, writes Woodcock. His extensive writings in French and English in the 1880s were to be seminal for all his thought, and his later writings are in effect expansions and buttressing of his ideas of this period. Kropotkin was rounded up in a general persecution of anarchists in France in 1883, and he spent some time in the prison of Clairvaux. In typical Kropotkin fashion, he spent this time extremely productively, writing articles, conducting classes for other inmates, even working in the prison garden. After intense public pressure from some of the most important and distinguished men of the period, the French government eventually released him, and in 1866 he returned to England, which was to be his home for the next 30 years. From this time on, influenced in no small way by his contact with the English socialist movement, he turned more and more to theoretical work, and began to stress the evolutionary rather than the revolutionary elements in social change. The major works of this later period of Kropotkin's life were The State, 1897, and Mutual Aid, in 1902. The latter work was perhaps influenced by his discovery of Godwin. It is certainly the case that Kropotkin elaborates on the Godwinian theme of universal benevolence, but these ideas had been present in any event, even if embryonically, in The Conquest of Bread. In the writing of Mutual Aid, Kropotkin availed himself of the information about animal and human cooperation he had gained in his time in Siberia. Mutual aid, Kropotkin believes, is the norm rather than the exception among animal species, including man. A Darwinian-type struggle for existence is not primarily an intra-human contest, but a contest between human societies and nature. Man is, and has always been, ineluctably social, so much so that even when the coercive instrument of the state arose, human voluntary cooperation did not cease. Woodcock remarks that mutual aid creates, of course, no departure in libertarian thought. It represents rather the classic statement of the idea common to most anarchists that society is a natural phenomenon, existing anterior to the appearance of man, and that man is naturally adapted to observe its laws without the need for artificial regulations. Woodcock believes that Kropotkin, and indeed many other anarchists, are insufficiently sensitive to the liberty-restricting activities of social groups other than the state. Woodcock writes, "A taboo-ridden native of the primitive Congo had in reality far less freedom of action than a citizen of the England in which Kropotkin himself lived with such slight interference. A stateless society, in other words, may be very far from a free society, so far as the personal lives of its members are concerned. It is true that the state is not the only enemy of liberty. And it is also true that social pressures to conform can be immense. But to repeat a point made earlier, there is a difference in kind between conformity induced by violence or the threat of violence and conformity induced by other means. It could be put to Woodcock that he, as a Millian, is oversensitive to the liberty-restricting aspects of social pressure. Mill is acutely aware of the lateral social pressures to conform. This is a very large theme in his On Liberty, but is overly sanguine when it comes to the deleterious effects of government on liberty. What, if anything, is significantly different about Kropotkin's anarchism? Kropotkin diverges from both Bakunin and Proudhon when it comes to the issue of access to goods and services. For both Bakunin and Proudhon, although in slightly different ways, the distribution of goods and services was directly related to a worker's contribution. For Kropotkin, however, all this is a remnant of a wage system, and a wage system he takes to be just another form of compulsion that has no place in a free society. Kropotkin asks, how then shall we estimate the share of each in the riches which all contribute to amass? Looking at production from this general synthetic point of view, we cannot hold with the collectivists that payment proportionate to the hours of labour rendered by each would be an ideal arrangement, or even a step in the right direction. Access to goods and services is to be based on need, not on the specific contributions of any one person or group. Anarchist communism called for the socialization not only of production, but of the distribution of goods, writes Schatz. The community would supply the subsistence requirements of each individual free of charge, and the criterion, to each according to his labour, would be superseded by the criterion, to each according to his needs. This, of course, is a form of communism. Kropotkin didn't invent it, but he certainly popularized it. Even in Kropotkin's time, the idea was not new and had found expression in many earlier thinkers. The feature that distinguishes anarchist communism from other libertarian doctrines is the idea of free distribution, which is older than anarchism itself, writes Woodcock. Sir Thomas More advocated it in the 16th and Winstanley in the 17th century. It was a feature of Campanella's City of the Sun, and even in the phalansteries imagined by Fourier, the rare individuals who could not be charmed into finding work attractive would still have their right as human beings to receive the means of living from the community. As with all forms of anarchism, anarcho-communism rejects the state, arguing that it is in no way coincident with society. Kropotkin remarks, men lived thousands of years before the first states were constituted. For us modern Europeans, the centralized states date but from the 16th century. He goes on to say, but ours is neither the communism of Fourier and the phalansterians, nor of the German state socialists. It is anarchist communism, communism without government, the communism of the free. It is the synthesis of the two ideals pursued by humanity throughout the ages, economic and political liberty. Kropotkin remarks, it is above all over the question of the state that socialists are divided. There are those, on the one hand, who hope to achieve the social revolution through the state by preserving and even extending most of its powers to be used for the revolution. And there are those, like ourselves, who see the state both in its present form, in its very essence, and in whatever guise it might appear, an obstacle to the social revolution, or the greatest hindrance to the birth of a society based on equality and liberty. State and government must not be confused, however. State and government are two concepts of a different order, writes Kropotkin. The state idea means something quite different from the idea of government. It not only includes the existence of a power situated above society, but also of a territorial concentration, as well as the concentration in the hands of a few of many functions in the life of societies. It implies some new relationship between members of society which did not exist before the formation of the state. A whole mechanism of legislation and of policing has to be developed in order to subject some classes to the domination of others. Nor must the state be confused with society. Man, Kropotkin says, did not create society. Society existed before man. We now also know that the point of departure for mankind was not the family, but the clan, the tribe. Society is based on a certain elemental human solidarity. Kropotkin's book, Mutual Aid, is an extended illustration of Kropotkin's belief that it is not love and not even sympathy upon which society is based in mankind. It is what he calls the conscience or consciousness, be it only at the stage of an instinct, of human solidarity. This is what Kropotkin calls mutual aid. Love and sympathy and morality generally is a development based upon this more primary instinct. In the book, Kropotkin shows this principle working in animal societies, in what he calls savage and barbarian human societies, in the medieval city, and, finally, among ourselves. Anarcho-communism not only rejects the state, it also rejects private property and capitalism. Even more strikingly, it also rejects money and markets. As a form of communism, it favours the common ownership of the means of production, but, again, as distinct from other forms of anarchism, it also favours common ownership of the products of labour as well. The reason for its rejection of the private ownership of the products of labour is logical, if not particularly practical. Anarcho-communists argue that without such common ownership of the products of labour, it is likely that individuals will eventually accumulate capital with the consequent reappearance of different and antagonistic social classes. Money and trade and markets are to be abolished. Money because it quantitatively and arbitrarily distinguishes between the value of one worker's output and another, and apart from the ever-present danger of capital accumulation, inhibits the qualitative distribution and consumption of goods. Markets and trade because, perhaps, of an implicit recognition that markets and trading invariably give rise to money, but also because markets underpin the notion that consumption should be proportioned to deeds rather than needs. Kropotkin is refreshingly direct in his comments on taxation. Taxation, he says, is an institution originating purely with the state. The formidable weapon used by the state in Europe, as in the young societies of the two Americas, to keep the masses under its heel, to favour its minions, to ruin the majority for the benefit of the rulers, and to maintain the old divisions and castes. How is all this to be given practical effect? In some minds, anarchism is inextricably associated with violence, whether rightly or wrongly. Kropotkin's attitude towards violence was somewhat ambivalent. In his earlier years, he was sympathetic to the need for violence, but as he got older, he disapproved of individual acts of terrorism and regarded assassinations as effectively useless and even demoralizing. If not violence, then what? Well, cooperation, voluntary cooperation. At this point, the idea of the commune comes to the fore. Communes, associations of people with common interests, will arise voluntarily, and the association of such associations will produce a form of overall cooperation that will replace the state. Communes will be responsible for the expropriation and collectivization of the means of production. Kropotkin believed that the economy could be coordinated by a horizontal network of associations, membership of which would be voluntary. He remarks that railways were constructed piece by piece. The pieces were joined together, and the 100 different companies to whom these pieces belonged gradually came to an understanding concerning the arrival and departure of their trains. All this was done by free agreement, by exchange of letters and proposals, and by congresses at which delegates met to discuss well-specified points and to come to an agreement about them, but not to make laws. There is no European central government of railways.